The rejection ceremony was supposed to be private. A quiet, dignified affair where the lesser party accepted their fate with grace and faded into the shadows of memory, as countless discarded Omegas had done before them. But when you're standing in the center of the grand throne room, surrounded by the most powerful wolves in the kingdom, with your heart pounding against your ribs like a caged bird and every instinct screaming at you to submit, well, sometimes survival looks a lot like defiance. Ethan Thorne had spent his entire 23 years being invisible. As an Omega in a world that valued strength above all else, he'd learned early that the best way to survive was to make himself small. To keep his head down, his voice quiet, and his eyes on the floor. He'd grown up in the shadow of his older brother Marcus, the golden alpha heir who could do no wrong, while Ethan was merely the afterthought, the spare Omega who would eventually be married off to some minor Pax Beta to seal a political alliance. He'd made peace with that future. Had even started to convince himself it wasn't so bad. At least he'd be useful. At least he'd have a purpose. Then the moon goddess had laughed at his carefully constructed plans and given him the one thing he never expected, a mate. Not just any mate, either. Julian Blackwood. Alpha of the Northern Territories. The most powerful, most feared, most ridiculously attractive wolf in the entire kingdom. The kind of alpha that Omegas whispered about in dark corners, dreaming of bonds that would never come. Except it had come. For Ethan. The bond had hit him like a thunderbolt during the annual Moonstone gathering. One moment he'd been standing in the corner of the Great Hall, trying to disappear into the wallpaper while the nobility swirled around him like glittering sharks. The next, his entire world had narrowed to a single point of light, a pair of storm-gray eyes that had locked onto his from across the room and refused to let go. Julian had felt it too. Ethan had seen the recognition flash across the devastatingly handsome face, the sudden awareness, the primal recognition, the impossible pull of fate made manifest. For one breathless moment, Ethan had dared to hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe the moon goddess had finally decided to be kind. Maybe his life was about to become something other than a long, quiet slide into obscurity. Then Julian's expression had shifted. From wonder to something else. Something cold. Something that looked terrifyingly like disgust. A mistake, Ethan had heard him mutter to his beta later that evening. The moon goddess must have made a mistake. Ethan had spent the next 3 days watching Julian interact with his pack, watching the barely concealed contempt in those storm-gray eyes every time he was forced to acknowledge Ethan's existence. He'd watched Julian charm the other unmated wolves, powerful alphas and beautiful betas with prestigious bloodlines and impressive abilities. Wolves who would make suitable mates for an alpha of his standing. Wolves who weren't embarrassments. But Ethan had also watched the way Julian looked at him when he thought no one was paying attention. The hunger in his gaze when the mate bond flared between them. The way his hands would clench into fists when Ethan was near, as if he was fighting the urge to reach out. The way his jaw would tighten when another alpha so much as looked in Ethan's direction. The bond was real. The attraction was undeniable. But Julian's pride was stronger than both. Which brought them to tonight. The formal Moonstone ceremony, where all mate bonds discovered during the king's visit would be officially recognized or formally rejected. Ethan had known what was coming. He'd seen it in Julian's cold, professional demeanor all day. He'd felt it in the way Julian had positioned himself as far from Ethan as possible during the pre-ceremony rituals, the way he'd avoided looking at Ethan directly, the way he'd made it abundantly clear that this union was never going to happen. Ethan had come to the throne room prepared to accept his rejection gracefully. To bow his head, whisper his acceptance, and fade into obscurity like the good little Omega he'd always been raised to be. Then Julian had opened his mouth. I, Julian Blackwood, Alpha of the Northern Territories, formally reject the mate bond between myself and Ethan Thorne. His voice had carried across the marble pillars with cold, crystalline clarity. This bond is unsuitable. The Omega lacks the strength, the breeding, the capabilities required of a mate in my position. I request that this bond be dissolved and the Omega released from all obligations to my pack. The words had landed like physical blows. Ethan felt them in his chest, in his gut, in the delicate space where his wolf had curled itself around the bond and made a home. He felt the bond splintering, felt the agony of rejection beginning to crawl through his veins like poison. He was supposed to accept it now. That was how it worked. The rejected party said yes, you're alpha, or I understand, or whatever words would get them out of the room fastest. They thanked the alpha for their consideration, for their honesty, for their mercy in making the rejection swift and clean. They did not cause a scene. They did not make things difficult. But as Ethan stood there, watching the smug expressions on the faces of the noble wolves who'd always known he didn't belong, watching Julian's cold indifference, something inside him snapped. It wasn't his heart that had been breaking steadily for 3 days. It was his fear. For the first time in his 23 years of making himself small, Ethan Thorne stopped caring what people thought of him. And apparently, when you stopped caring about fitting in, you discovered you had a lot more power than anyone had ever given you credit for. He lifted his chin. His voice, when it came out, was steady. Carrying. Impossible to ignore. I, Ethan Thorne, accept your rejection, Alpha Julian Blackwood. A ripple of surprise went through the crowd. This was the expected response. They'd probably thought he'd be crying, or begging, or at least showing some sign of the devastation that had to be tearing him apart inside. Instead, he sounded almost calm. But he wasn't finished. However, he continued, turning to face the ancient law books that sat on a pedestal near the king's throne, I also invoke my rights under the reciprocal rejection clause of the moon goddess statutes. I reject you in return, Julian Blackwood. Our bond is now formally severed by mutual agreement. You are no longer bound to me, and I am no longer bound to you. The silence that followed was absolute. Ethan could hear the crackling of the ceremonial fires, the rustle of expensive fabrics, the sharp intake of breath from 1,000 throats. He could hear his own heartbeat, loud in his ears, and the distant sound of his wolf howling in triumph and terror. Then the whispers started. They swept through the throne room like a wildfire, gaining speed and intensity as the implications of what he'd just done sank in. In 300 years of werewolf law, no rejected mate had ever dared to speak those words back to their alpha. No Omega had ever been brave or foolish enough to invoke the reciprocal rejection clause. Julian's face had gone completely blank. The kind of dangerous calm that preceded either complete submission or total annihilation. You can't reject me back, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. That's not how this works. Ethan felt something wild and reckless unfurling in his chest. It was the mate bond finally snapping, or maybe it was 23 years of being invisible finally reaching a breaking point. Either way, he found himself smiling. Actually smiling, in the face of the most powerful alpha in the kingdom, while the entire nobility watched. Actually, he said, turning toward the ancient law books, according to the original moon goddess statutes, any mate bond acknowledged by both parties can be dissolved by either party. The fact that most rejected wolves choose not to reject back doesn't mean they can't. It just means they're too afraid to try. A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd. Ethan could see several of the court scholars frantically flipping through their own copies of the law books, their expressions growing more surprised by the second. He's correct, stammered the head scholar, a thin wolf named Marcus who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The reciprocal rejection clause exists. It's never been invoked before. Because. He trailed off, looking helplessly at Julian. Because no one has ever been foolish enough to try, Julian finished, his voice deadly quiet. But something had shifted in the room's energy. What had started as a humiliating public rejection was now something else entirely, a legal challenge that even the king couldn't ignore. And there was something else, too. Something Ethan hadn't expected. Across the room, he met Julian's eyes, and for just a moment, the mask slipped. Beneath the cold anger, beneath the pride and the fury in the carefully constructed walls, Ethan saw something that made his breath catch. Fear. Julian was afraid. Not of the legal challenge, not of the political implications, afraid of him. Afraid of what this rejection meant, afraid of the bond that still pulsed between them like a living thing. It should have made Ethan feel triumphant. Instead, it just made him feel sad. Sad that Julian had spent his whole life so terrified of vulnerability that he'd rather destroy his own happiness than risk being genuinely known by someone. Fascinating, King Aldrich said slowly, leaning forward on his throne. His voice carried the weight of centuries, and when he spoke, everyone listened. In 300 years of rule, I have never witnessed a reciprocal rejection. Tell me, young Thorn, do you understand what you've just done? Ethan's newfound courage flickered slightly under the king's intense stare, but he forced himself to stand straighter. I've rejected the Alpha who rejected me, Your Majesty. Nothing more, nothing less. Nothing more? Julian stepped closer, and Ethan could feel the fury radiating off him in waves. You've just challenged the natural order. Alphas don't get rejected by Omegas. By Omegas like me, you mean? Ethan finished. He was shaking, but he'd be damned if he let anyone see it. You're right. Alphas don't usually get rejected by anyone, because most wolves are too afraid to use their own goddess-given rights. But I'm not most wolves. The lie came so smoothly he almost believed it himself. The truth was, he was terrified. His heart was hammering so hard he was sure everyone in the room could hear it. But he was also angry. Angrier than he'd ever been in his life. And anger, he was discovering, was a hell of a lot more useful than fear. This is unprecedented, King Aldrich mused. For the first time since entering the throne room, he looked genuinely entertained. Marcus, what does the law say about reciprocal rejections? The head scholar cleared his throat nervously. According to the ancient texts, Your Majesty, when both parties formally reject the mate bond, it creates what's called a severed bond status. Both wolves are considered legally free to pursue other mates, with no obligation to their former bond partner. Interesting. The king's eyes gleamed with something that made Ethan's instincts prickle with warning. And what about compensation? Compensation? Ethan and Julian spoke in unison. Oh, yes. King Aldrich smiled, showing teeth that were still perfectly sharp despite his advanced age. The severed bond status requires compensation to be paid by the party who initiated the rejection sequence. Since Alpha Blackwood spoke first. The color drained from Julian's face. Your Majesty, surely you can't be serious. The Blackwood pack assets are considerable, yes, but... Which makes this all the more intriguing. The king's smile widened. Tell me, Ethan Thorne, are you familiar with the traditional compensation for a severed mate bond? Ethan's mouth went dry. He'd been running on pure adrenaline and righteous anger, but he hadn't thought beyond the moment of rejecting Julian back. The idea that there might be legal consequences that benefited him, hadn't even occurred to him. I know of it, Your Majesty. I'm not familiar with the specifics. The rejected party, Marcus read from his book, his voice growing stronger as he found his footing in familiar legal territory, is entitled to claim equivalent status compensation. Meaning if an alpha rejects a mate, and that mate reciprocally rejects, the rejected party gains the right to claim alpha status and territory equivalent to what they would have gained through the mate bond. The throne room erupted in shocked whispers. Ethan felt his knees go weak as the full implications hit him. He'd just gone from a rejected Omega to someone who could potentially claim alpha territory. He'd just become a legal threat to the most powerful pack in the kingdom. You mean? He started. I mean, King Aldrich said, his ancient eyes twinkling with something that might have been mischief, that you, Ethan Thorne, have just legally claimed the right to your own alpha territory. Congratulations, my dear boy. You've just gone from rejected mate to pack leader in the span of a single conversation. The look of absolute horror on Julian's face was almost worth the heart attack Ethan was currently having. Almost. The celebration in Ethan's heart lasted exactly 14 seconds. That's how long it took for Julian to recover from his shock and remember that he was an alpha who had never lost a battle, political or otherwise, in his entire life. Your Majesty, Julian said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous, while I appreciate the educational value of this legal exercise, I think we're overlooking something important. King Aldrich raised an eyebrow. Oh? The reciprocal rejection law requires that both parties be of equal standing when the bond is acknowledged. Julian's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Ethan Thorne may have been born into the Thorne pack, but he's not actually a member anymore. Ethan's blood turned to ice. What do you mean? I mean, Julian continued, pulling a document from his jacket with theatrical flair, that 3 hours ago, your pack leader, your own brother, Marcus Thorne, formally expelled you from the pack for conduct unbecoming of pack loyalty. The paper rustled as he unfolded it, and Ethan could see Marcus's signature at the bottom even from across the room. His own brother's signature. Authorizing his exile. The expulsion was filed with the Royal Registry this afternoon, Julian went on, his voice growing stronger as he sensed victory. Which means that when you attempted to reject me back, you were no longer a pack member. You were a rogue wolf. And rogue wolves have no legal standing to invoke reciprocal rejection rights. The throne room spun around Ethan as the full scope of the trap became clear. This hadn't been a spontaneous humiliation. This had been planned. Orchestrated. His own brother, the one who was supposed to protect him, the one who'd promised their dying mother that he'd always take care of Ethan, had sold him out for political favor with the most powerful alpha in the kingdom. Marcus, Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible over the renewed murmuring of the crowd. He could see his brother now, standing near the back of the throne room with tears streaming down his face. But Marcus didn't deny it. Didn't speak up to defend Ethan or claim the document was forged. He just stood there, crying silent tears that felt like knives in Ethan's chest. The expulsion is properly documented, Marcus confirmed after examining the papers, his voice heavy with something that might have been sympathy. Filed at 3:47 p.m. today, with 2 witness signatures and the official pack seal. Which means, Julian said triumphantly, that Ethan's attempted rejection holds no legal weight. He spoke as a rogue, and rogues cannot invoke mate bond law. The original rejection stands, with no compensation required. King Aldrich studied the document for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Ethan held his breath, hoping against hope that the ancient monarch might find some loophole, some technicality that could save him from this public destruction. Instead, the king nodded slowly. The law is clear. Without pack standing, there can be no reciprocal rejection. His eyes found Ethan's across the room. I'm sorry, child. You played the game well, but you were outmaneuvered before it began. The defeat was crushing, but it was the betrayal that truly destroyed Ethan. He looked again at Marcus, the brother who had raised him after their parents died, who had taught him to read and fight and survive, who had held him through nightmares and told him he was worthy of love. The brother who had thrown him to the wolves, literally, for a chance to curry favor with Julian Blackwood. Why? Ethan asked, his voice breaking on the single word. Marcus finally spoke, his words barely a whisper but carrying clearly in the silent throne room. He promised to protect the pack. Said if I helped him avoid the political complications of rejecting his mate, he would ensure our territory remained secure. Our people would be safe. Our people? Ethan repeated hollowly. But not me? You were never really one of us, Ethan. Each word was a separate blade. Your designation, your strength, we all knew you'd never truly belong. This way, at least your sacrifice means something. At least the pack survives. The cruel mathematics of it was breathtaking. Trade one worthless Omega for the protection of dozens of others. From a purely practical standpoint, it was the smart play. From a human standpoint, from a brother standpoint, it was the kind of betrayal that shattered souls. Ethan felt something inside his chest crack and fall away. Not his heart, which had already been broken by Julian's initial rejection. But something deeper. The part of him that had always believed that if he just tried hard enough, was good enough, quiet enough, he might eventually earn his place in the world. That part died right there on the marble floor of the throne room, in front of hundreds of witnesses who were now looking at him with a mixture of pity and second-hand embarrassment. Well then, he said, his voice surprisingly steady for someone whose entire world had just collapsed. I suppose that settles it. He turned to face Julian, who was watching him with something that might have been satisfaction, or might have been regret. It was hard to tell, and Ethan found he no longer cared. Congratulations, Alpha, he said with a small bow. You won. I hope it was worth the effort. He started toward the throne room doors, planning to walk out with whatever dignity he could salvage. Maybe find a cliff somewhere and contemplate whether jumping off it would be more or less painful than living with this level of humiliation. But King Aldrich's voice stopped him before he'd taken 3 steps. Ethan Thorne. The ancient monarch's voice carried an odd note of anticipation. Before you go, there's something else you should know. Ethan turned back, too emotionally exhausted to feel hope or fear. The king smiled, and this time there was something predatory in the expression. You may not be able to invoke reciprocal rejection rights as a rogue. But there is one other legal avenue available to you. Your Majesty? Marcus looked confused. The right of challenge, King Aldrich said simply. Any wolf who has been wronged by an alpha may invoke the ancient right to challenge them for dominance. Win, and you gain everything they would have lost to reciprocal rejection compensation. Lose. He shrugged eloquently. Lose and you die, Julian finished, his voice tight with something that might have been worry. Precisely. The king's eyes gleamed. Tell me, Ethan Thorne, are you familiar with the right of challenge? Ethan's mouth was too dry to speak, so he just shook his head. It's quite simple, really. King Aldrich continued conversationally. Single combat. No weapons. No assistance. No mercy. The challenged party chooses the time and manner of combat, but it must take place within 7 days of the challenge being issued. Winner takes all. He leaned forward in his throne, and for the first time all evening, he looked genuinely interested in the outcome. The question is, do you have the courage to issue such a challenge? Or will you walk away and live with the knowledge that you let them destroy you without a fight? The throne room held its breath. Even Marcus had stopped crying, watching Ethan with wide, horrified eyes. Julian, for his part, looked like a man watching a mouse decide whether to attack a cat, confident in the outcome, but surprised by the potential audacity. Ethan looked around the room at all the faces watching him. Noble wolves who had never known hunger or rejection. Powerful alphas who had been born into their strength. Court officials who served at the pleasure of kings and never had to wonder if they'd have a home tomorrow. None of them understood what it was like to have nothing left to lose. But Ethan was about to show them. I, Ethan Thorne, invoke the right of challenge against Alpha Julian Blackwood. The words left his mouth before his rational mind could stop them. They hung in the air like a death sentence, which, realistically, they probably were. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Half the throne room gasped in shock while the other half burst into excited whispers. Someone in the back actually started laughing, a high, disbelieving sound that cut through the chaos like a blade. Julian stared at him as if he'd just sprouted a second head. You can't be serious. Dead serious, Ethan replied, surprised by how calm he sounded. Inside, his wolf was pacing frantically, whining about the insanity of challenging an alpha who could probably snap his neck with one hand. But the human part of him, the part that was tired of being small and scared and forgettable, felt oddly peaceful. "This is madness," Marcus whispered from his spot near the back wall. "Ethan, please. Just walk away. You've made your point." "Have I?" Ethan turned to face his brother. "What point would that be, Marcus? That I'm exactly as weak and worthless as everyone always believed? That you were right to trade me away like damaged livestock? That's not what That's exactly what you meant." Ethan's voice carried a strength he didn't know he possessed. "You meant that I was expendable. That my life, my happiness, my future, none of it mattered as much as your political convenience." He turned back to King Aldrich, who was watching the proceedings with a delighted expression of someone enjoying an unexpectedly entertaining show. "Your Majesty, I formally request that you witness my challenge." "Witnessed and accepted," the king replied immediately, clearly having the time of his ancient life. "Alpha Blackwood, you are legally bound to respond. Will you accept the challenge?" Julian looked around the room as if hoping someone would explain how his perfectly orchestrated evening had gone so completely sideways. His beta, a broad-shouldered wolf named Derek, was making frantic abort mission gestures from the sidelines. "She's a rogue with no pack training," Julian said finally. "He's never even been in a real fight. This isn't a challenge, it's assisted suicide." "Nevertheless," King Aldrich said cheerfully, "the law is the law. You must either accept the challenge, or formally acknowledge him as your superior and grant him the compensation he originally claimed." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan could practically see the wheels turning in Julian's head as he weighed his options. Accept the challenge and risk looking like a bully who killed harmless rogue Omegas for sport. Or back down and lose face in front of the entire supernatural political establishment. "Fine," Julian said eventually, his voice tight with controlled fury. "I accept. But I choose the terms of combat." "Of course you do," Ethan muttered. 7 days from tonight. At the Moonrise Arena. Shifted combat. No weapons. Fight to submission or... Julian paused, giving Ethan one last chance to back down. "Or death." "Agreed." The word came out steadier than Ethan felt. "Then it's settled," King Aldrich announced, clapping his hands together with evident satisfaction. "Let the record show that Ethan Thorne has invoked the right of challenge against Alpha Julian Blackwood, with combat to take place in 7 days' time. Until then, both parties are under royal protection and may not be harmed or interfered with by any other party." He stood from his throne, a clear signal that the evening's entertainment had concluded. "Court is dismissed. I do so look forward to next week's festivities." As the assembled nobles began filing out of the throne room, chattering excitedly about the unprecedented drama they just witnessed, Ethan found himself standing alone in the center of the marble floor. Alone, and beginning to realize the full scope of what he just committed himself to. 7 days to prepare for a fight against one of the most powerful alphas in the kingdom. 7 days to somehow become strong enough to survive combat with a wolf who had been training for battle since childhood. 7 days to figure out how to avoid being torn apart in front of hundreds of spectators. 7 days to live. "Ethan." Marcus's voice was small and broken as he approached. "Go away," Ethan replied without turning around. "Please, You did what you had to do, right?" Ethan finally faced the brother who had raised him. Protected the pack. Kept everyone safe. "I hope you sleep well at night, knowing that your sacrifice was worth it." Marcus's face crumpled. "I never wanted this. I thought if you just accepted the rejection quietly, you could start over somewhere else. Find a small pack that would take you in. Maybe find happiness with someone more suitable." More suitable? Ethan laughed, but there was no humor in it. You mean weaker. Someone who wouldn't make me dream above my station. I meant someone who could love you without destroying you, Marcus whispered. For a moment, Ethan's anger wavered. He could see the genuine pain in his brother's eyes, the regret that came too late to change anything. Part of him, the part that had been a brother for 23 years, wanted to forgive. To understand. To find some way to salvage something from the wreckage of their relationship. But then he remembered standing in this same throne room 20 minutes ago, hearing Marcus confirm his expulsion without even trying to defend him. Remembered the careful planning that had gone into ensuring Ethan's humiliation was as complete as possible. If you had loved me, Ethan said quietly, you would never have signed that expulsion order. Love doesn't come with political calculations, Marcus. What you felt for me was convenience at best. He turned and walked toward the throne room doors, where a small group of royal guards was waiting to escort him to whatever accommodations had been prepared for condemned challengers. Ethan, wait. Marcus's voice was desperate now. Where will you go? How will you prepare? You can't face him alone. Ethan paused at the threshold, his hand on the massive wooden door. I've been alone my whole life, he said without looking back. I just finally stopped pretending otherwise. The doors closed behind him with a sound like thunder, cutting off Marcus's reply and sealing Ethan's fate. The Tower of Contemplation was exactly as depressing as it sounded. Built into the eastern wall of the royal castle, it was traditionally used to house prisoners of noble birth, wolves who had committed crimes serious enough to warrant confinement, but whose bloodlines were too valuable to simply execute outright. The circular stone room had one window, one bed, one desk, and the kind of oppressive silence that made you acutely aware of your own mortality. Ethan had been staring at the ceiling for 3 hours when the knock came. Enter, he called, assuming it was a servant bringing his evening meal or another stack of combat manuals that wouldn't do him any good against an alpha who could probably bench press a small car. Instead, the royal guard captain stepped into the room, followed by a figure that made Ethan's breath catch in his throat. The man was ancient. Not in the tired, weathered way of old humans, but in the timeless, dangerous way of predators who had survived centuries through cunning rather than strength. His silver hair was braided with small bones and dark stones, and his eyes held the kind of knowledge that came from watching empires rise and fall. Ethan Thorne, the captain said formally, may I present Oracle Damien Moonwhisper, keeper of the old ways and advisor to 3 generations of kings. Ethan scrambled to his feet, suddenly aware that he was in the presence of werewolf royalty. Oracle Damien was a legend, the last of the ancient shamans who remembered magic from before the Great Suppression, when werewolves had power beyond just shifting shapes. Your Majesty, Ethan stammered, then caught himself. I mean, Oracle. I apologize, I don't know the proper. Child, Oracle Damien interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. In 3 days, you're going to die. Unless something changes dramatically, we don't have time for proper etiquette. He moved into the room with fluid grace, settling into the single chair as if it were a throne. The guard captain retreated to the doorway, clearly planning to stand guard. I've come to make you an offer, the oracle continued. One that could save your life, if you're brave enough to accept it. Ethan's heart began to race. What kind of offer? The kind that your great-grandmother would have understood. Oracle Damien's eyes glittered in the candlelight. Tell me, child, what do you know about your bloodline? Your real bloodline. Not the watered-down story Marcus told you about failed warriors and forgotten rogues. Ethan sat back down hard on the bed. I don't know anything about my real bloodline. Marcus found me when I was 5. I don't remember anything from before then. Of course you don't. Memory suppression was part of the binding spell. The oracle leaned forward, studying Ethan's face with uncomfortable intensity. But bindings weaken over time, especially under extreme emotional stress. Tell me, have you noticed anything unusual in the past few days? Dreams, perhaps? Flashes of scenes that feel like memories but couldn't possibly be yours? Ethan's mouth went dry. How did you? Because I cast the original binding 20 years ago, at the request of a dying woman who wanted to protect her grandson from enemies who would kill him for his heritage. Oracle Damien's expression softened slightly. Your real name isn't Ethan Thorne, child. It's Ethan Silverblood. Last surviving heir of the Moon's crown bloodline. The room spun around Ethan as memories he dismissed as weird dreams suddenly snapped into focus. A woman with silver hair singing lullabies in an ancient language. A man with eyes like starlight teaching him to call wolves down from the mountains. A burning building and screams and someone shoving him into a cave while shouting about protection spells and hidden bloodlines. The Moon's crown bloodline, he whispered. But that's extinct. Everyone knows the Silverbloods were wiped out during the Purge Wars. Everyone knows what we wanted them to know. Oracle Damien's voice was gentle. Your grandmother, Isabella Silverblood, was the most powerful Alpha Queen in werewolf history. She could command wolves across entire kingdoms. Could shift into forms that legends are made of. Could work magic that made the earth itself tremble. She was also smart enough to know that power like that makes you a target. So she hid you. She died protecting you, the oracle said quietly, along with the rest of your family. When the coalition of lesser alphas decided that the silver bloodline had become too powerful to allow to continue. You were 5 years old. The sole survivor. Hidden away with binding spells that would suppress your abilities until you were old enough to claim them safely. Ethan felt like he was drowning. You're saying I'm what? Some kind of secret werewolf prince? I'm saying you're the genetic descendant of the most powerful supernatural bloodline in recorded history. And that your abilities have been artificially suppressed for 2 decades. Oracle Damien stood, moving to the window to stare out at the moonlit courtyard. I'm also saying that those bindings are starting to crack. And in 3 days, you're going to need every advantage you can get. But if I'm so powerful, why haven't I felt it? Why am I still just? Because power without training is just dangerous potential. The oracle turned back to face him. Which brings me to my offer. I can break the binding spells tonight. I can give you access to your full heritage, your complete abilities, everything your bloodline should have granted you from birth. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. What's the catch? Oracle Damien smiled, showing teeth that were too sharp to be entirely human. Smart boy. The catch is that 20 years of suppressed power, released all at once, will either kill you or transform you into something beyond current werewolf understanding. There's no middle ground. No partial awakening. You either survive the transition and become what you were born to be, or you die in the process. And if I don't take the offer? Then you face Alpha Julian Blackwood with the abilities of an average rogue Omega. And you die in approximately 30 seconds after the combat begins. The choice, when laid out like that, didn't feel like much of a choice at all. What would I become? Ethan asked. If I survived the transition, what exactly would I be? Oracle Damien's expression grew distant, as if he were seeing something far beyond the stone walls of the tower. You would become what your great-grandmother was, before the other alphas grew too frightened to let her live. A true alpha queen. A wolf who can command pack bonds across kingdoms. Who can shift into forms that exist beyond normal werewolf limitations. Who can work the old magic that shaped the world before humans learned to fear what they couldn't understand. He paused, meeting Ethan's eyes directly. You would become powerful enough that Julian Blackwood would kneel at your feet and beg for the mercy he never showed you. The image was intoxicating. Ethan could almost see it, Julian's face, when he realized what Ethan truly was. Marcus's horror when he understood what he'd thrown away. The entire supernatural world learning that the silver bloodline hadn't died out after all. But he could also imagine dying in agony as 20 years of suppressed power tore him apart from the inside. "How long do I have to decide?" he asked. "The ritual must be performed at midnight on the night before your challenge," Oracle Damien replied. "The moon will be at its strongest, and you'll need every advantage the lunar cycle can provide. That gives you 4 days to choose. Continue as you are and die as a forgotten rogue. Or risk everything for the chance to reclaim your birthright." He moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing, child. If you choose the ritual and survive, there will be no going back. You cannot suppress power once it's been awakened. Cannot pretend to be small and harmless once you've shown the world what you truly are. You will spend the rest of your life as either a king or a target." "And if I'm both?" Oracle Damien's smile was sharp as winter moonlight. "Then the supernatural world is about to become a much more interesting place." For days had never felt shorter or longer simultaneously. Ethan spent them in a strange liminal space between his old life and whatever came next. During the day, he trained with the Royal Guard captain and his best fighters, learning basic combat techniques that felt laughably inadequate against an alpha of Julian's caliber. During the evenings, he pored over ancient texts that Oracle Damien had provided, journals and spellbooks written in the old tongue that his suppressed memories were slowly helping him decipher. And during the long, sleepless nights, he wrestled with a decision that would either save his life or end it more dramatically than Julian ever could. On the third night, he had an unexpected visitor. The knock was soft, almost apologetic. When Ethan opened the door, he found himself face to face with a young man about his own age, someone with the kind of ethereal beauty that marked high-ranking wolf nobility. Golden hair, perfect features, and eyes the color of forest shadows. "Ethan Thorne," the man said hesitantly. "My name is Aiden Moonstone. I was supposed to be Alpha Julian's chosen mate, before you complicated things." Ethan blinked in surprise. He'd heard whispers about Aiden Moonstone, son of the Western Pax Alpha, blessed with both beauty and political connections. The kind of perfect match that powerful families arranged for their heirs. "I'm sorry," Ethan said automatically, then caught himself. "Actually, no. I'm not sorry. You're better off without him." Aiden's laugh was bitter. "That's what I came to tell you, actually. You're not the first mate he's rejected." He stepped into the room uninvited, his nervous energy filling the small space. "May I sit? This is complicated." Ethan gestured to the chair, settling onto the bed himself. "Complicated how?" "Julian and I have known each other since childhood. Our families always assumed we'd eventually mate. Good bloodlines, compatible territories, all the usual political advantages." Aiden's hands twisted in his lap. "But when we both came of age and no mate bond appeared, my father pushed for an arranged mating anyway. Political alliance masquerading as romance. But Julian refused. Oh, no, he was perfectly willing to go through with it. Until 3 months ago, when he met his true mate during a border negotiation." Aiden's expression darkened. "A beautiful beta from the southern Pax named Celeste Ravenclaw. The bond was immediate. Powerful. Undeniable." Ethan felt something cold settle in his stomach. What happened to him? The same thing that almost happened to you. Except he wasn't brave enough to fight back. Aiden's voice was flat with suppressed anger. Julian rejected him publicly. Claimed he wasn't suitable for an alpha of his standing. Celeste accepted it quietly, like a good little wolf, and disappeared into exile. And then he found you. And then he found me. Aiden met Ethan's eyes directly. "Do you want to know the real reason he rejected you so viciously? It wasn't because you weren't good enough. It was because you were too good. The mate bond between you two was stronger than anything he'd ever experienced. Stronger even than what he felt for Celeste. And that terrified him. The room fell silent as Ethan processed this information. Everything he'd assumed about Julian's motivations, about his own unworthiness, suddenly looked different through this lens. He's afraid of genuine connection, Ethan said slowly. He's afraid of losing control, Aiden corrected. Julian has spent his entire life being told he's destined for greatness. That he'll unite the werewolf kingdoms through strategic alliances and careful political maneuvering. The idea of being genuinely vulnerable to someone, of needing them in ways he can't control or manipulate, it goes against everything he thinks he is. Ethan stood and walked to the window, staring out at the moonlit courtyard where he would either die or triumph in less than 24 hours. Why are you telling me this? Because I've spent the last 4 days watching the political fallout from your challenge. Aiden's voice was intense. The other alphas are nervous. Not about the fight itself, everyone assumes Julian will win easily. They're nervous about what happens after. After what? Think about it. You've just demonstrated that rejected mates have more legal rights than anyone realized. You've shown that the old laws can be invoked by anyone brave enough to use them. Word is already spreading to other packs, other territories. There's talk of other rejected wolves coming forward. Of challenges being issued against alphas who thought they were untouchable. Ethan turned back to face his visitor. You think I've started something? I think you've lit a fuse that's been waiting to explode for decades. Aiden stood and moved toward the door, then paused. There's something else you should know. Julian isn't planning to fight fair. Ethan's blood chilled. What do you mean? I mean he's been meeting with a combat enhancer named Victor Shadowbane. Someone who specializes in augmenting alpha abilities for important fights. Aiden's expression was grim. It's not technically illegal, since the enhancers are derived from natural werewolf hormones. But it's definitely not sporting. So he gets to be supernaturally enhanced and I get to be naturally dead. Unless you find your own advantages. Aiden reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather journal. This belonged to Celeste Ravenclaw. He left it behind when he went into exile. And I thought you might find it useful. Ethan took the journal, feeling the weight of secrets in its worn leather binding. What's in it? Everything he learned about Julian during their brief time together. His fighting style. His weaknesses. His fears. Aiden smiled grimly. Turns out rejected mates make very thorough intelligence gatherers. After Aiden left, Ethan sat on his bed with Celeste's journal in his lap, afraid to open it. Part of him didn't want to know Julian's secrets, didn't want to understand him better than he already did. It was easier to hate someone when they remained a mystery. But easier wasn't going to keep him alive tomorrow night. He opened the journal and began to read. Day 1, met my mate today. Alpha Julian Blackwood of the Northern Territories. The bond hit like lightning. I've never felt anything so intense. He seemed equally affected, but there was something in his eyes, fear. Why would an alpha fear his own mate? Day 3, Julian keeps avoiding being alone with me. When we are together, he's charming but distant. Like he's playing a role instead of being himself. I catch him watching me sometimes, and the hunger in his gaze makes my wolf purr. But then he looks away and becomes cold again. Day 7, I think I understand now. He's not afraid of me. He's afraid of how much he wants me. Afraid of how the mate bond makes him feel out of control. He told me tonight that alphas can't afford to show weakness. Can't afford to need anyone more than they need him. Day 12, he's going to reject me. I can see it in the way he's pulling back, the way he talks about political necessities and appropriate matches. Part of me wants to fight for what we have. But I'm tired of begging for scraps of affection from someone who sees love as a weakness. Ethan closed the journal, his hands shaking slightly. He'd expected tactical information about fighting techniques or physical vulnerabilities. Instead, he'd found something much more dangerous: understanding. Julian wasn't just a cruel alpha who enjoyed destroying lesser wolves. He was a man so terrified of vulnerability that he'd rather destroy his own happiness than risk being genuinely known by someone. The question was, would that knowledge help Ethan survive tomorrow night? Or would it get him killed by making him hesitate at a crucial moment? Midnight came with the sound of footsteps on stone. Ethan had been awake for hours, staring at the full moon through his narrow window and wrestling with the decision that would define the rest of his life. Oracle Damien's offer sat like a weight in his chest: risk everything for power, or face Julian with nothing but determination and die within minutes. When the ancient werewolf entered his cell, he moved with the fluid grace of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. "Have you decided, child?" Oracle Damien asked without preamble. Ethan took a deep breath. "I have questions first." "Of course you do. Ask them quickly. The moon's power peaks in less than an hour, and we'll need every moment if you choose the ritual. If I survive the awakening, what exactly will I become? You said I'd be like my great-grandmother, but what does that actually mean in practical terms?" Oracle Damien settled into the chair, his ancient eyes reflecting moonlight like a predator's. Isabella Silverblood could command any werewolf within 100-mile radius. Not suggest, not influence, command. Their wolves would submit to hers, regardless of their human mind's wishes. She could shift into forms that don't exist in nature: wolves the size of bears with strength that could shatter stone and speed that made her appear to teleport. He paused, letting that sink in. She could also work the old magic. Call storms. Heal mortal wounds. See through the eyes of any wolf in her territory. At the height of her power, she was essentially a one-woman army with supernatural intelligence gathering. And the other alphas killed her because they were afraid. They killed her because she was planning to unite all werewolf territories under a single crown, her own. She believed that scattered, feuding packs made all werewolves vulnerable to human discovery and persecution. She wanted to create a shadow nation, a supernatural kingdom that could protect our people properly. Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the stone walls around him. She wanted to rule them all. She wanted to save them all, Oracle Damien corrected. The methods were debatable, but her goals were noble. Even if her approach was authoritarian. "And you think I'd make the same choices?" The Oracle's smile was enigmatic. "I think you'd make your own choices. The question is whether you'll live long enough to make any choices at all." Ethan stood and walked to the window, looking out at the moonlit courtyard where tomorrow night's battle would take place. He could see workers already setting up the combat arena, a circular space marked with ancient symbols, surrounded by tiered seating for the hundreds of spectators who would come to watch him die. "There's something else," he said quietly. "I've been having dreams." "Not the suppressed memories you mentioned, new dreams." "Dreams where I'm standing in that arena and I'm different. Stronger. But also angry. Angrier than I've ever been in my life." "Power amplifies what's already inside you," Oracle Damien said carefully. "If you're carrying rage, awakening your abilities will make that rage proportionally stronger as well. What if I can't control it? What if I become something worse than the alphas who destroyed my family?" The question hung in the air between them like a sword ready to fall. Oracle Damien was quiet for a long moment, studying Ethan with the intensity of someone seeing all the way through to his soul. "Do you know what your great-grandmother's greatest strength was?" he asked finally. "Her power? Her doubt." The Oracle stood and moved to stand beside Ethan at the window. Isabella questioned every decision. Agonized over every choice. constantly worried that she was becoming the very thing she'd set out to fight against. It was that doubt, that constant self-examination, that kept her human even when she wielded godlike power. He placed a weathered hand on Ethan's shoulder. The fact that you're afraid of becoming a monster is the best evidence I have that you won't become one. Monsters don't worry about their own monstrosity. Ethan closed his eyes, feeling the weight of generations pressing down on his shoulders. His family's legacy. His people's survival. His own desperate need to prove that he was worth more than the world had told him. If I do this, he said slowly, and if I survive both the awakening and the fight, what happens next? Do I just go home? Pretend to be normal? Child. Oracle Damien laughed, a sound like silver bells in a winter storm. If you survive tomorrow night as a fully awakened Silverblood, normal will never be an option again. Every alpha in the kingdom will either want to serve you or destroy you. Every rejected wolf will look to you as either salvation or false hope. Every human government will add you to their supernatural threat assessment lists. You're not exactly selling this. I'm being honest about the cost. The oracle's expression grew serious. Power always comes with a price. The question is whether you're willing to pay it to save your own life and possibly change the world in the process. Ethan thought about Marcus, crying silent tears as he signed away Ethan's life for political convenience. About Julian, so terrified of genuine connection that he'd rather destroy his own mate than risk being vulnerable. About Celeste Ravenclaw and countless other wolves who'd been cast aside by a system that treated them as disposable. About the workers in the courtyard below, setting up an arena where he was expected to die quietly and let the status quo continue unchanged. There's one more thing I need to know, he said. The ritual, what are the actual odds of survival? Oracle Damien was quiet for so long that Ethan began to think he wouldn't answer. Historically, the ancient werewolf said finally, about 1 in 4. But those statistics include wolves who attempted the awakening ritual without proper bloodline heritage, without emotional catalyst, without desperate need driving them forward. And with all those factors? With all those factors, your odds improve to perhaps 1 in 3. Ethan felt his stomach drop. 67% chance of death, just from the ritual itself, before he even faced Julian. Yes. But 100% chance of death if you face him without it. The mathematics were brutal but clear. Die almost certainly trying to become powerful enough to survive, or die absolutely certainly as the wolf he currently was. He turned away from the window and met Oracle Damien's ancient gaze directly. What do I need to do? The Oracle's smile was proud and terrified in equal measure. Are you certain? Once we begin, there's no turning back. Either you'll emerge as one of the most powerful supernatural beings on the planet, or you'll die in more agony than any wolf should ever experience. I'm certain. Then we begin now. Remove your clothes. The ritual requires direct contact between your skin and the moonlight. As Ethan undressed, Oracle Damien began pulling items from a leather bag that seemed to contain far more than its size should allow: crystalline vials filled with silver liquid, carved bones that looked ancient beyond measure, a knife with a blade that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it. The process has 3 stages, the Oracle explained as he arranged the items in a precise pattern around the small room. First, I'll break the binding spells that have suppressed your abilities since childhood. This will feel like your skin is being torn away from the inside. Lovely. Second, your true wolf will emerge for the first time. This may involve physical transformation beyond normal shifting. Your great-grandmother's wolf form was unique. This stage typically causes loss of consciousness from the pain. And the third stage? Ethan's voice was steadier than he felt. Third stage is when your human consciousness merges with your awakened abilities. If your mind can't handle the power, if the rage or pain or sheer overwhelming sensation breaks your sanity. He shrugged eloquently. You go mad. And I'll be forced to kill you before you can hurt innocent people. Ethan nodded, surprised by how calm he felt. Maybe he was already going mad, and the ritual would just make it official. One last question, he said. If I survive all 3 stages, will I still be me? Will I still be Ethan? Or will I become someone else entirely? Oracle Damien's expression softened. You'll still be you, child. Just more than you ever imagined you could be. Outside, the moon reached its zenith, flooding the stone room with silver light. It's time, Oracle Damien said, raising the obsidian knife toward the window. Are you ready to discover what you truly are? Ethan took a deep breath and stepped into the center of the ritual circle. I'm ready. The first cut drew blood that gleamed like liquid starlight in the moonbeams. And the ancient words Oracle Damien spoke seemed to make the very air vibrate with power. The breaking had begun. The first stage felt like being struck by lightning from the inside out. Ethan's scream echoed off the stone walls as Oracle Damien's blade traced symbols across his arms, each cut releasing 20 years of suppressed power in violent bursts. The binding spells shattered like glass, and with each break, memories flooded back with crystalline clarity. A woman with silver hair lifting him toward the stars, you are the moon's son, little wolf. Never forget what you are. Fire consuming his childhood home while his grandmother fought a dozen attackers at once, run, little star. Run and hide until you're strong enough to reclaim what's yours. Marcus finding him in the cave 3 days later, terrified and alone, I'll keep you safe, little brother. But we must never speak of what you were before. The memories came faster now, 20 years of suppressed identity crashing back in waves that left him gasping. He remembered his real name, his real heritage, the lullabies his grandmother had sung in the old tongue that spoke of power and responsibility and the terrible weight of leadership. Stage 1 complete, Oracle Damien announced, his voice sounding distant and strange. Your bindings are broken. Can you hear me, child? Ethan tried to answer, but his voice emerged as something between a growl and a sob. The pain was indescribable. But underneath it, he could feel something else building, power. Raw, ancient, terrible power that made his skin feel too small to contain it. Stage 2 begins now, the Oracle warned. Try not to fight what's coming. The transformation started in his bones. Ethan had shifted into wolf form hundreds of times throughout his life, and it had always been smooth, natural, as easy as breathing. This was nothing like that. This felt like his skeleton was being rewritten from the inside out, like his very DNA was being reforged in cosmic fire. His wolf form, when it finally emerged, was nothing like the small gray creature he'd always been. He was massive, easily twice the size of any normal werewolf, with fur that shifted from silver to black like liquid moonlight. His eyes blazed with inner fire, and when he opened his jaws to howl, the sound shattered every piece of glass in the tower. But it was the third stage that nearly killed him. As his consciousness merged with his awakened abilities, Ethan felt his mind expand beyond anything he'd thought possible. Suddenly, he could sense every werewolf within miles, their locations, their emotions, their pack bonds. He could feel the pull of their wolves, the instinctive recognition of his superior bloodline that made them want to submit even from a distance. He could also feel their fear. Word of his challenge had spread throughout the supernatural community, and dozens of powerful wolves had come to witness tomorrow night's spectacle. They were all here now, in the castle and the surrounding areas, and they were all terrified of what he might become. Good, his wolf purred with vicious satisfaction. Let them fear us. Let them understand what it means to underestimate a silverblood. But it was what he sensed from the royal quarters that made his blood run cold. King Aldrich wasn't alone in his private chambers. He was meeting with 3 other alphas, powerful wolves whose territories bordered the kingdom's most strategic resources, and they were planning to ensure that tomorrow night's challenge ended with Ethan's death, regardless of the outcome of his fight with Julian. Cannot allow a silver blood to survive, Alpha Marcus Ironwood was saying, his words carrying clearly to Ethan's enhanced senses. If he defeats Julian, he'll have legal claim to his territory and resources. If he dies fighting him, he becomes a martyr that other rejected wolves might rally around. Either outcome destabilizes the current power structure. The boy must die. Agreed, Alpha Vincent Shadowmere added. But it must look natural. An accident during combat, perhaps. Or a heart attack from the stress of fighting above his abilities. I have contacts among the arena workers, Alpha David Stormclaw said. Silver dust in the combat circle would weaken his wolf considerably. Make him vulnerable to a killing blow that might not otherwise succeed. King Aldrich's ancient voice was thoughtful. And if he proves more resilient than expected? Then we activate the contingency plan, Alpha Marcus said grimly. Crossbow bolts from the spectator galleries. Make it look like rogue wolf hunters infiltrated the crowd. The kingdom mourns a tragic attack, and the silver bloodline dies with him. Ethan's transformed consciousness reeled with the implications. The challenge itself was meaningless, they'd never intended to let him survive, regardless of whether he won or lost. He was a threat to be eliminated, not a legal combatant to be respected. They fear us because they know what we could become, his wolf snarled. They remember what grandmother could do. And they won't risk letting history repeat itself. But there was something else in the supernatural currents around the castle, something that made his newly awakened instincts prickle with warning. Marcus was here. His brother was in one of the guest quarters, and he wasn't alone. Julian was with him, along with someone whose psychic signature felt wrong in ways that made Ethan's enhanced senses recoil. He focused his attention on that room, using abilities he was still learning to understand, and what he discovered made his stomach turn. Enhancement process is complete, a voice like grinding stone was saying. The alpha strength has been tripled, his speed doubled, his healing accelerated beyond normal werewolf parameters. The Omega won't survive 30 seconds of combat. And the side effects? Marcus's voice was small and worried. Temporary, the stranger assured him. Enhanced aggression, reduced empathy, possible loss of rational thought during combat. But these fade within hours of the enhancer wearing off. You are turning him into a monster, Marcus whispered. I'm ensuring the natural order remains intact. Julian's voice was different now, harder, more vicious than Ethan had ever heard it. The silver bloodline ends tomorrow night, and werewolf society remains stable. Ethan felt his enhanced consciousness processing the information at superhuman speed. Julian had been chemically altered to ensure his death. The king and his allies were planning to assassinate him if he somehow survived the rigged combat. Marcus had helped orchestrate the entire trap and was now having second thoughts that came 24 hours too late. He was surrounded by enemies who had planned his destruction down to the smallest detail. Then we give them something to truly fear, his wolf growled. Let them see what happens when they back a silver blood into a corner. Ethan. Oracle Damien's voice cut through his expanding awareness like a blade. Focus on my voice. You're losing yourself to the power. Come back to me. With tremendous effort, Ethan pulled his consciousness back from its supernatural expansion and focused on the ancient werewolf kneeling beside him. Oracle Damien's face was pale with concern, and Ethan realized he'd been unconscious for several minutes while his awakened abilities ran wild. I'm back, he managed, his voice still carrying harmonics that made the stone walls vibrate. How do you feel? Ethan took inventory of his transformed body and expanded consciousness. The pain was gone, replaced by a sense of power that was both intoxicating and terrifying. He could feel every heartbeat in the castle, could sense the emotional states of wolves miles away, could command pack bonds with a thought. He had become exactly what his great-grandmother had been, a supernatural apex predator with abilities that transcended normal werewolf limitations. I feel. He started, then stopped as the full implications hit him. Oracle, they're not planning to let me survive tomorrow night. regardless of whether I win the challenge.
What do you mean?
Ethan quickly explained what he'd overheard using his enhanced senses.
Oracle Damien's expression grew darker with each revelation.
I feared as much, the ancient werewolf said when Ethan finished. The political implications of your survival are too significant for them to leave to chance.
So what do I do? I can't run, they'd hunt me down.
I can't hide, they know what I am now.
And I can't fight them all, even with these new abilities.
Oracle Damien was quiet for a long moment, studying Ethan with calculating eyes. There is one option, he said finally. But it's risky beyond measure, and it will change everything.
Tell me.
We don't wait for tomorrow night's challenge. We act tonight, while they think you're still weak and unprepared. The Oracle's smile was sharp as winter moonlight.
We remind the werewolf world why the silver bloodline was feared enough to require genocide.
Ethan felt his enhanced abilities purr with anticipation.
What did you have in mind?
Revolution, child. Swift, decisive, and absolutely terrifying. Oracle Damien stood, power radiating from his ancient frame. It's time to show them what happens when they underestimate a wolf with nothing left to lose. The throne room doors exploded inward at precisely 2 minutes past midnight. Ethan strode through the splintered wood with Oracle Damien at his side, his transformed wolf form radiating power that made the very air shimmer. The royal guards stationed outside hadn't even had time to raise an alarm, his enhanced abilities had sent them into submission before they could react. King Aldrich looked up from his private council with the 3 conspirator alphas, his ancient face registering genuine shock for the first time in centuries.
Impossible, Alpha Marcus Ironwood breathed. The ritual wasn't supposed to happen until tomorrow night.
Surprise, Ethan said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the crystal chandeliers ring like bells. Turns out, when you plan someone's assassination in elaborate detail, they tend to take preemptive action. He shifted back to human form, a process that now took less than a heartbeat, and stood before them wearing clothes that Oracle Damien had conjured with old magic. His silver hair fell past his shoulders in waves that seemed to capture and hold moonlight, and his eyes blazed with power that made even the king flinch. Ethan Silverblood, King Aldrich said slowly, using his true name for the first time. You've made a terrible mistake coming here.
Have I?
Ethan stepped further into the room, his enhanced senses monitoring every wolf in the castle. Because from where I'm standing, the only mistake was trusting that you'd honor the laws you claim to uphold. He turned his gaze to each of the conspirator alphas in turn.
Silver dust in the combat circle, Alpha Stormclaw? Really? I expected more creativity from someone of your reputation.
Alpha David went pale.
You couldn't possibly know.
I know everything that happens within 100 miles of me, Ethan interrupted.
Every conversation. Every heartbeat.
Every desperate plan to ensure I don't survive long enough to become a threat to your comfortable little power structure.
He focused on Alpha Marcus next. Crossbow bolts from the galleries, dressed as rogue hunters to provide plausible deniability. Tell me, did it ever occur to you that maybe, just maybe, if you need to assassinate someone to maintain your power, you don't deserve that power in the first place?
This is treason, Alpha Vincent Shadowmere snarled, starting to shift. You dare threaten us in the king's own. Ethan's power lashed out like a whip, and suddenly Vincent was frozen mid-transformation, his wolf caught between forms in what looked like agonizing suspension.
I'm not threatening you, Ethan said softly. I'm giving you information about what happens next.
You can choose to listen, or you can choose to test whether I'm bluffing about my abilities. But I promise you my great-grandmother could command any wolf within her range. I inherited that ability, along with several others you've probably forgotten about. He released Vincent, who collapsed to the floor gasping. The other alphas took several steps back.
Your Majesty.
Oracle Damien spoke for the first time, his ancient voice carrying the weight of centuries.
The silver bloodline was eliminated because Isabella wanted to unite all werewolf territories under a single crown. The conspiracy succeeded because you sanctioned it.
Because you feared losing your own throne to someone more powerful than yourself. King Aldrich's expression hardened.
That was necessary for the stability of.
Necessary for your continued rule, Oracle Damien corrected. But now her grandson stands before you, awakened and aware of the full scope of your betrayal.
The question is, what happens next? The throne room fell silent as everyone processed the implications.
Ethan could feel the supernatural currents shifting as wolves throughout the castle became aware of his presence and power. Some were afraid, others curious, a few felt something that might have been hope. "I'm going to make you an offer," Ethan said, addressing King Aldrich directly. "One chance to salvage the situation without bloodshed."
"I'm listening."
"You allow my challenge against Julian to proceed as planned. But fairly, no enhancements on his side, no assassination attempts on mine, no rigged combat circles. Just two wolves settling a legal dispute according to your own laws."
He paused, letting that sink in. "If he defeats me legitimately, I accept the outcome and leave the kingdom forever. And if you win?"
"If I win, I claim the territory I'm legally entitled to. And you stop treating rejected wolves like disposable garbage." Ethan's voice grew harder. "I'm not trying to overthrow you or unite the kingdoms or recreate my grandmother's empire. I just want to live without constantly looking over my shoulder for the next political knife aimed at my back."
Alpha Marcus laughed bitterly. "You expect us to believe you'll be content with a single territory? That you won't use your abilities to expand your power until you control everything?"
"I expect you to honor your own laws," Ethan shot back. "Or admit that werewolf justice is a fiction designed to protect the powerful and crush anyone who dares challenge the status quo." He turned in a slow circle, addressing not just the conspirators but every wolf whose enhanced senses were monitoring this confrontation from elsewhere in the castle.
"I know you're all listening.
Every alpha, every beta, every wolf who came to watch me die tomorrow night for your entertainment." His voice carried through pack bonds and supernatural channels, reaching hundreds of listeners simultaneously.
"You've been told I'm a threat to stability. That I'm dangerous.
That the silver bloodline deserved extinction." He paused, letting the silence stretch.
"But ask yourselves, who decided that? Who declared my family too dangerous to exist? Who wrote the laws that make it legal for powerful alphas to reject and destroy their mates with impunity?"
His eyes blazed brighter. "It was the same wolves who benefit most from keeping the rest of you in line. The same wolves who are planning to murder me tomorrow because they're terrified of what might happen if you all realize you have more power than they've let you believe."
The supernatural currents in the castle shifted as his words hit home. He could feel doubt spreading through the assembled wolves, questions that had been suppressed for generations suddenly demanding answers.
"Your Majesty," he said, turning back to King Aldrich, "you have until dawn to decide. Either you honor your laws and let my challenge proceed fairly, or I invoke my grandmother's legacy and start doing things the way she would have done them."
"Is that a threat?"
"It's a choice." Ethan's smile was sharp. "My grandmother wanted to rule through force because she believed werewolves needed a strong hand to survive. I'd prefer to live in a world where justice actually means something. Where legal rights aren't just convenient fictions for the powerful to hide behind." He started toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and one more thing.
I know about the enhancements Julian received.
Whatever that alchemist gave him, it needs to be reversed before tomorrow night. Or the challenge is forfeit, and I claim my compensation by default."
"You can't possibly prove."
"I can sense the chemical corruption in his system from here," Ethan interrupted.
"My abilities include detecting supernatural alterations to wolf biology."
"So either he fights me clean, or you admit publicly that you rigged the challenge and accept the legal consequences." He walked toward the door, Oracle Damien falling into step beside him.
The royal guards stepped aside automatically, their wolves recognizing his superior bloodline even if their human minds hadn't caught up yet. Ethan.
King Aldrich's voice stopped him at the threshold.
If I agree to your terms, if the challenge proceeds fairly and you win, what then? What do you actually want?
He looked back over his shoulder at the ancient monarch who had sanctioned his family's genocide and nearly succeeded in finishing the job. I want what every rejected wolf wants, Your Majesty. To be seen as something more than a political inconvenience. To have my worth determined by my choices rather than my bloodline or how useful I am to someone else's ambitions. His eyes found each of the conspirator alphas in turn.
And I want you all to remember this moment.
Remember what happened when you cornered a silver blood and assumed he'd die quietly.
Because the next rejected wolf who invokes their rights might not be as interested in peaceful solutions as I am.
The Moonrise Arena was designed for spectacle, not fairness. Ethan stood in the center of the ancient combat circle as thousands of werewolves filled the surrounding tiers, their voices creating a wall of sound that would have been overwhelming before his transformation. Now, his enhanced senses filtered the noise into individual conversations, letting him hear everything from excited betting on his survival time to whispered speculation about whether the silver blood rumors were true. The moon hung full and heavy overhead, its light turning the white marble arena into something ethereal and deadly. Across the circle, Julian emerged from the Alpha's entrance to thunderous applause. Even purged of his chemical enhancements, he was magnificent, tall and powerful, moving with the predatory grace of someone who had never lost a fight in his life. His storm gray eyes locked onto Ethan's, and for a moment, the mate bond flared between them like lightning. Ethan could feel his confusion, his anger, his reluctant admiration for what Ethan had become. And underneath it all, buried so deep he probably didn't recognize it himself, desire. King Aldrich stood in the royal box, his ancient voice magically amplified to carry across the arena. We gather tonight to witness a legal challenge under the old laws, he announced. Ethan Silverblood, last heir of the Moon's Crown bloodline, has invoked the right of challenge against Alpha Julian Blackwood of the Northern Territories. The terms are clear, single combat in shifted form, no weapons, no assistance. Victory goes to submission, death, or surrender. He paused, his eyes finding Ethan's across the distance. Let it be known that this challenge proceeds under royal witness, with no interference from external parties. The outcome will be honored by all, regardless of personal preferences or political implications. The warning was clear, the conspirators had been told to stand down. At least for tonight. Combatants, prepare yourselves, King Aldrich commanded. On my signal, you may begin. Ethan shifted into his transformed wolf form, feeling power ripple through his enhanced body. He was massive now, nearly twice Julian's size even in his alpha form, with silver black fur that seemed to drink moonlight and eyes that blazed with inner fire. The crowd gasped at the sight. This was no ordinary wolf, this was something out of legend, a creature that belonged in ancient stories about the moon goddess herself. Julian shifted as well, his own wolf form impressive but suddenly seeming almost small in comparison. His black fur bristled with aggression, but Ethan could sense his uncertainty. This wasn't the easy kill he'd been promised when he agreed to the challenge. This was something else entirely. Begin! King Aldrich's voice cracked like a whip. Julian lunged immediately, moving with the speed and precision of extensive combat training. He aimed for Ethan's throat, a killing blow designed to end the fight in seconds. Ethan's enhanced reflexes made him seem to move in slow motion. He sidestepped easily, using his greater size to knock Julian off balance with a casual swipe of one massive paw. Julian tumbled across the marble, recovered with impressive agility, and came at him again. This time, Ethan caught him mid-leap, his jaws closing around Julian's shoulder with enough force to make him yelp in pain. But he didn't crush, not yet. Instead, he threw Julian across the arena like a rag doll. The crowd's excited cheering faltered into confused murmurs. This wasn't a fight, it was a demonstration of overwhelming superiority.
Julian struggled to his feet, blood matting his fur where Ethan's teeth had punctured his shoulder. His eyes were wild now, the careful strategy of a trained fighter giving way to desperate survival instinct. "He's afraid," his wolf observed. "Good. Let him feel what we felt when he rejected us in front of the world." But as Julian circled warily, looking for an opening that didn't exist, Ethan felt something unexpected: pity. He remembered Celeste's journal entries, the descriptions of a man so terrified of vulnerability that he'd rather destroy his own happiness than risk being truly known. He remembered Oracle Damien's words about power amplifying what was already inside, and realized that what he felt wasn't murderous rage or revenge lust. It was disappointment. Disappointment that someone with so much potential had chosen fear over growth. That an alpha who could have been great had settled for being merely powerful. That his mate, the wolf the moon goddess herself had chosen for him, would rather kill him than face his own emotional cowardice. Julian lunged again, and this time Ethan didn't dodge. He let Julian tackle him, let his jaws close on his neck in what would have been a killing bite against any ordinary wolf. But Ethan's transformed body was far from ordinary, his teeth couldn't penetrate Ethan's enhanced hide. He felt the pressure but no pain, and the shocked confusion radiating from Julian was almost comical. "This is what you rejected," Ethan projected through the pack bonds, knowing Julian could hear him even in wolf form. "This power. This heritage. This connection. You threw it all away because you were too afraid to be vulnerable." He threw Julian off with minimal effort, rising to his full height so the entire arena could see the massive silver-blood wolf in all his terrifying glory. "I could kill you right now," he continued. "End this in seconds and claim everything you tried to deny me. Your territory. Your resources. Your pack." Julian struggled to his feet, his wolf form battered and bloodied. But instead of attacking again, he did something that shocked everyone watching. He bowed his head in submission. The arena erupted in chaos. Alphas didn't submit, especially not to rejected Omegas, especially not in public challenges with thousands of witnesses. But there was Julian, the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories, offering his throat to a wolf he'd tried to destroy less than a week ago. "Why?" Ethan demanded through their bond connection. He felt Julian's response, raw with emotions he'd spent a lifetime suppressing: "Because you were right about all of it. I was so afraid of needing you that I convinced myself you weren't worth having. But standing here, seeing what you've become, despite everything I did to break you." He lifted his head slightly, meeting Ethan's blazing eyes. "I don't deserve your mercy. But I'm asking for it anyway." Ethan stood frozen, torn between the satisfying simplicity of revenge and the complicated messiness of grace. His wolf wanted blood, wanted to make Julian pay for every moment of humiliation and pain. But his human heart remembered Celeste's journal entries, remembered that Julian was as much a victim of the system as he was, just in a different way. He'd been taught that vulnerability was weakness, that genuine connection was dangerous, that an alpha's worth was measured in power rather than compassion. He could kill Julian and prove that the strong survive by crushing the weak. Or he could spare him and prove that strength included choosing mercy when you had every right to choose violence. "Get up," he commanded through their bond. "This fight is over. But you're not dead yet." Julian rose slowly, his wolf form trembling with a mixture of relief and shame. Ethan shifted back to human form, standing naked in the moonlight with power radiating from every inch of his transformed body. Oracle Damien was already moving toward him with clothes, but Ethan's voice carried across the silent arena before he could cover himself. "I, Ethan Silverblood, claim victory in this challenge by submission," he announced. "As is my right under the old laws, I claim compensation equivalent to what I would have gained through the mate bond." He paused, letting the legal implications sink in for everyone watching. "However, I'm also invoking my right to negotiate the specific terms of that compensation with the defeated party, rather than claiming Julian's territory outright. I propose an alternative arrangement.
King Aldrich leaned forward in his royal box, clearly fascinated by this unexpected development. The Northern Territories will be split, Ethan continued.
Julian retains control of the primary regions and his existing pack.
But the borderlands, the territories where rejected wolves and rogues currently struggle to survive, those become mine.
I establish a new pack for wolves who have been cast aside by the current system.
A place where your worth isn't determined by your bloodline or your designation, but by your choices and your character. The arena erupted in shocked whispers. He was essentially creating a sanctuary for the supernatural society's unwanted, and doing it with the legal authority that came from defeating an alpha in challenge. Furthermore, he said, raising his voice over the commotion, any alpha who rejects a true mate from this day forward must offer equivalent compensation directly to the rejected party.
No more quiet disappearances. No more convenient exiles. No more wolves being thrown away because they're politically inconvenient.
He turned to face King Aldrich directly. These terms are my official claim for compensation. I trust you'll honor them as you promised to honor the outcome of this challenge. The ancient monarch was silent for a long moment, his calculating eyes studying Ethan with new appreciation. The terms are unusual, he said finally.
But legal under the old laws.
Very well, Ethan Silverblood, your claim is recognized. The borderlands of the Northern Territories are hereby granted to you as sovereign territory, with full rights to establish pack law as you see fit. He stood from his throne, and his next words carried the weight of royal decree.
Let it be known throughout all werewolf territories that the Silver Bloodline has returned.
And let it also be known that the laws regarding mate bonds and rejection have been revised to include mandatory compensation.
Any alpha who violates these terms will answer to the crown. 3 months later, the borderlands of the Northern Territories had transformed in ways Ethan hadn't imagined possible.
Where there had been struggling rogue camps, there were now established settlements. Where there had been desperate survival, there was now community. Rejected wolves from across the kingdom had come seeking sanctuary, and Ethan had welcomed them all. His pack had grown to nearly 200 wolves, outcasts and rogues, and those who simply didn't fit the traditional pack structure. They were building something new here, something that valued individuals for their contributions rather than their designations or bloodlines. It wasn't perfect, there were still territorial disputes with neighboring packs, still political pressure from alphas who resented the changes he'd forced on their society. But every day brought new wolves seeking refuge, new stories of mates invoking their rights to compensation, new evidence that the system was slowly changing. Marcus had come to visit last week, asking for forgiveness that Ethan wasn't ready to give. But they'd really talked, for the first time in months. Maybe someday they'd rebuild their relationship into something honest. Or maybe they wouldn't. Either way, Ethan was learning that he could survive without his brother's approval. Julian had kept his distance, working on his own territory and reportedly treating his pack members with unprecedented fairness. Ethan heard through Oracle Damien that he'd started therapy with a supernatural counselor, actually addressing the emotional issues that had led to his pattern of rejection. Whether that would be enough to salvage their mate bond remained to be seen, but at least he was trying. As for Ethan himself, he stood on the cliff overlooking his new territory, watching the sun set over lands that now belonged to his pack. Wolves who had once been invisible were now building homes and lives and futures. We did it, his wolf said contentedly. We survived. We claimed our power. And we're using it to help others instead of crushing them. We did, Ethan agreed aloud, feeling the weight of responsibility and possibility in equal measure. He was Ethan Silverblood, last heir of the Moon's Crown bloodline, alpha of the Borderlands pack. He was powerful beyond imagination, legally recognized, and finally valued for exactly who he chose to be. And in a world that had tried so hard to destroy him, that might have been the greatest victory of all.